January 1943. The sun burned relentlessly over the bamboo barracks of a small civilian internment camp in the Dutch East Indies. The air shimmered with heat, heavy with the mingled scents of sweat, damp wood, and unwashed bodies. Inside, the prisoners, mostly Japanese women caught far from home, sat on rough wooden planks, their eyes darting at the occasional sharp whistle of a guard. Voices were hushed, whispers swallowed by the ever-present fear. Each footstep outside the thin walls carried a weight no one dared to name. The metal clatter of boots against the wooden floors punctuated the oppressive quiet. Laundry hung in lines, moving slowly in the heat, as if even the air conspired to smother any sense of comfort. Rumors passed silently between the women. New rules, new punishments, new commands that tested the limits of their endurance. Every day, the boundaries of what could be demanded from them shifted, a silent reminder of the control held by those who walked the camp's perimeter. And in this simmering tension, far beyond the fences, the war in the Pacific raged on, setting the stage for the ordeals that would forever mark these women's lives. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire had swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with unprecedented speed. The fall of Singapore in February, followed by the occupation of the Dutch East Indies, placed millions under Japanese control. Among them were civilian populations, including women and children, and captured military personnel from Allied forces. In these early months, Japanese authorities moved quickly to establish internment camps, transforming schools, warehouses, and barracks into prisons. Allied prisoners, soldiers and civilians alike, were forced into camps that were often overcrowded, unsanitary, and insufficiently supplied. Records from the International Red Cross indicate that by mid-1942, tens of thousands of civilians, including women, were interned across the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and British Malaya. The administration of these camps was fragmented. Some fell under the Japanese army, others under the Kempeitai military police, and still others under local auxiliary units. Conditions varied, but patterns of deprivation were consistent. Limited food, minimal medical care, hard labor, and rigid discipline. Women prisoners occupied a particularly precarious position. Many were Japanese civilians caught far from home, separated from their families, and placed under strict surveillance. Unlike male POWs, whose value lay in labor or military intelligence, women were often considered expendable, their treatment reflecting a mixture of ideological contempt and opportunistic control. They lived in constant uncertainty. Could a minor infraction provoke punishment? Would the guards' whims extend beyond the expected labor into humiliation? This environment created a silent terror. The camp's daily rhythm, roll calls, meager meals, and forced chores concealed the ever-present threat of abuse. Letters from internees, later recovered, describe a pervasive anxiety, a waiting for the unknown. Rules shifted without warning, and the lack of oversight meant that transgressions, real or imagined, could provoke extreme consequences. The women learned to observe and anticipate the guards' moods, to speak only when permitted, and to cling to small acts of solidarity in order to survive. It was in this suspended reality, heat-soaked barracks, whispered warnings, and an invisible line between safety and suffering, that the conditions for abuse took root. Fear became both weapon and shield, shaping every movement, every glance, every breath. And yet, despite the oppression, these women endured, their resilience quietly building the framework for the perspectives, stories, and angles that history would later uncover. Among the many internment sites across Southeast Asia, several became infamous for their harsh conditions and systemic abuse. One such camp was the women's section at Batu Lintang in Borneo. where Japanese authorities confined a mix of Dutch, British, Australian, and local civilians. The barracks were cramped, constructed of bamboo and palm leaves, with little ventilation to combat the tropical heat. Sanitation was minimal, water scarce, and disease a constant threat. Similar conditions were documented at camps in Java, Sumatra, and the Philippines, each site reflecting the broader logistical strain on Japan's occupation forces. The chain of command in these camps was rigid, yet inconsistent. Guard units were drawn from both the Imperial Japanese Army and the Kempeitai, with authority sometimes overlapping or conflicting. Commanders enforced strict discipline, often justifying excessive punishment as necessary for maintaining order or as a reflection of military honor. Testimonies from survivors reveal a culture among guards that combined unquestioning obedience to authority with a casual cruelty toward those under their control. Ideological indoctrination reinforced this mindset. Prisoners were often regarded as inferior, their suffering a natural outcome of their status and Japan's perception of wartime hierarchy. The pressures of war amplified these dynamics. Supply shortages, the constant threat of Allied counterattacks, and overextended lines of communication left camp administrators with limited resources. Prisoners were made to compensate, performing arduous labor, from repairing roads and airfields to cultivating rice, often under extreme heat and without sufficient nourishment. These conditions created not only physical hardship, but also psychological vulnerability, making internees more susceptible to abuse and humiliation. Women, in particular, faced a dual vulnerability. They were expected to fulfill traditional domestic roles within the camp while enduring the same labor and surveillance as men. The absence of gender-specific protections, combined with the guards' unchecked authority, made sexual harassment and coercion a tragic reality in some camps. Even minor infractions, a misaligned uniform, a whispered complaint, could provoke punishments that blurred the line between military discipline and personal cruelty. In this tightly controlled and volatile environment, fear became a constant companion. The uncertainty of each day, what orders would be given, which rules would shift, which guards' moods would dictate the outcome, ensured that prisoners remained perpetually vigilant. Every step through the barracks, every glance at the perimeter, carried the weight of potential consequence. It was here, within the human angle. Inside the bamboo walls, life was measured in small, relentless tasks. Women rose before dawn, enduring the sweltering heat as they swept floors, carried water, or tended the meager garden plots. Meals were rationed, often consisting of thin rice porridge and a small portion of vegetables. The daily struggle was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Prisoners developed coping mechanisms to endure the monotony and fear. Shared whispers, quiet prayers, and simple rituals of hygiene or storytelling became acts of defiance against despair. Even the smallest gestures, a folded piece of cloth, a whispered encouragement, offered fleeting moments of dignity. Leadership Angle camp commanders wielded absolute authority. Decisions were often arbitrary, based on reports of minor infractions or perceived disrespect. Some officers adhered strictly to military regulations, enforcing discipline with calculated severity. Others acted with personal cruelty, exploiting the prisoner's vulnerability to assert dominance. Policies ranged from forced labor assignments to restrictions on correspondence and medical care. Commanders justified these actions as necessary to maintain order, yet in practice, their leadership often intensified fear, eroded morale, and blurred the line between regulation and abuse. The women internalized these hierarchies, learning to navigate a world where survival depended as much on understanding the guard's temperament as on performing assigned tasks. Enemy angle. The mindset of the Japanese military toward prisoners was shaped by both ideology and culture. Captured civilians and Allied soldiers were considered inferior, their suffering often rationalized as a natural outcome of Japanese superiority. Historical accounts describe a perception that discipline and harsh treatment were not only necessary, but morally justified. Obedience to authority, honor, and loyalty formed the core of military indoctrination, leaving little room for compassion. In practice, this ideology created an environment where abuse could occur without hesitation, and where prisoners' humanity was systematically devalued. For the women, this meant living under constant vigilance, their actions scrutinized, their resistance limited to subtle, often invisible forms of endurance. These perspectives, the human struggle, the exercise of authority, and the enemy's ideological framework, intertwined within the camp walls. They shaped the daily realities of survival, creating a complex web of fear, resilience, and control that defined the prisoners' lives. And within this tension, the moral and logistical dimensions of internment would soon emerge, further complicating the women's struggle. Moral ethical angle. The treatment of women prisoners in Japanese camps starkly violated principles later codified in the Geneva Conventions. Historical records and survivor testimonies document systematic abuse, forced labor, and humiliation that contravened international law. Prisoners were deprived of basic human rights, sufficient food, medical care, privacy, and protection from sexual harassment. Even when Japanese authorities claimed to follow regulations, enforcement was inconsistent, leaving the vulnerable entirely at the mercy of individual guards. These moral breaches were compounded by the lack of accountability within the camp structure, allowing cruelty to be justified under the guise of discipline or necessity. Technological, logistical angle. The physical layout and construction of the camps reflected both practical necessity and control. Bamboo and wooden barracks offered minimal ventilation and little protection from tropical storms. Perimeter fencing, barbed wire, or rudimentary bamboo barriers was designed less for containment than for intimidation. Guard towers overlooked the compounds, providing constant surveillance with minimal manpower. Supply shortages, exacerbated by extended supply lines and the pressures of ongoing campaigns, meant that rations were limited, sanitation was poor, and medical supplies were scarce. These logistical deficiencies were exploited, intentionally or not, as instruments of control, ensuring that prisoners remained weakened and psychologically dependent on the authorities. Psychological angle. The long-term psychological impact on survivors was profound. Constant fear, hunger, and uncertainty eroded a sense of safety and personal autonomy. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal enduring trauma. Nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance persisted long after liberation. Coping mechanisms developed in the camps, quiet compliance, subtle resistance, reliance on communal support, shaped how survivors navigated post-war life. For many, the psychological scars were compounded by the stigma of having endured conditions considered shameful or humiliating, creating a complex interplay between memory, survival, and identity. Taken together, these angles illuminate the multifaceted reality of internment. They reveal a world where physical suffering, moral transgression, structural design, and psychological endurance intersected. Within this crucible, the prisoners' daily lives were shaped not only by the immediate presence of authority, but also by the broader context of war, ideology, and systemic neglect. And within these overlapping dimensions, the seeds of the camp's most decisive and harrowing moments were quietly being sown, moments that would soon define the climax of their ordeal. By mid-1943, conditions in women's internment camps across the Pacific had reached an unbearable intensity. At Batu Lintang in Borneo, documented records detail an escalation in both labor demands and punitive measures. Prisoners were forced to work from sunrise to sunset, repairing bombed airstrips and cultivating rice under a relentless tropical sun. Guards from the 25th Imperial Japanese Army, often accompanied by Kempeitai units, patrolled the compound, administering punishments for perceived infractions with alarming arbitrariness. One particularly harrowing account comes from a Dutch-Japanese woman who later testified in post-war tribunals. She described a routine inspection in which prisoners were ordered to remove clothing and submit to invasive searches, a command that compounded both physical vulnerability and psychological terror. Small acts of non-compliance, whispered murmurs of dissent, or even hesitation could provoke beatings, confinement in wooden stocks, or public humiliation. Records from the International Committee of the Red Cross, corroborated by survivor memoirs, indicate that these practices were not isolated but systemic, reflecting both the guards' indoctrination and the absence of oversight. In the midst of such oppression, prisoners displayed remarkable resilience. Women devised quiet strategies to protect one another, forming informal support networks, sharing scarce food, and maintaining coded communications to warn of impending inspections. Even simple gestures, a piece of cloth sewn into a garment, a shared story of home, became lifelines of morale. Survivor testimonies repeatedly emphasize the tension between fear and defiance, fear of immediate punishment, yet defiance in sustaining dignity and human connection in a space designed to erase both. These incidents, meticulously documented in camp reports, testimonies, and post-war trials, reveal the stark extremes of human endurance. The daily terror, the forced labor, and the arbitrary humiliations reached a crescendo during this period, establishing a turning point in the prisoner's experience. It was a moment when survival demanded not only compliance, but the quiet cultivation of courage, solidarity, and moral fortitude. As 1944 Samarbeitin progressed, the pressure on Japanese supply lines and the intensifying Allied offensives brought new tension to the camps. At Batulintang and other internment sites, food shortages worsened and forced labor intensified. Prisoners were pushed beyond endurance, tasked with clearing jungle, repairing bombed roads, and hauling water in oppressive heat. Guard units, including detachments of the 25th Imperial Japanese Army and Kempeitai officers, grew increasingly unpredictable. Minor mistakes could trigger public punishments, and rumors of executions, though rare, haunted every day. In November 1944, documented testimonies describe a sequence of escalated abuses during roll calls and inspections. Prisoners were ordered to perform physically exhausting drills, sometimes unclothed, under the scrutiny of guards who jeered or threatened them. These events, while horrifying, also showcased the women's resilience. They endured, whispering encouragement to one another, hiding injuries, and maintaining a semblance of dignity in impossible circumstances. By mid-1945, the tide of war began to shift decisively. Allied bombings and the Japanese retreat disrupted camp administration, reducing guard numbers and loosening strict routines. The psychological tension was compounded by uncertainty. Would liberation arrive, or would the camp's structure collapse into chaos first? Historical records show that liberation came gradually. On September 11, 1945, Australian forces formally liberated Batulintang, discovering emaciated prisoners and extensive evidence of forced labor and mistreatment. Allied investigators documented the conditions, recording testimonies that would later form the backbone of war crime prosecutions. These incidents became historically significant not merely as examples of cruelty, but as evidence of systematic violations of human rights and military law. The survivors' accounts informed post-war trials, influencing international understanding of POW treatment and setting legal precedents for the protection of civilians in conflict. For the women, liberation was both relief and trauma. Years of endurance culminated in freedom. Yet the memory of humiliation, fear, and survival would linger for decades. The climax of their ordeal, defined by both the cruelty of captivity and the courage of survival, set the stage for the aftermath, an era of reckoning, testimony, and reflection on what these experiences meant for history, humanity, and the laws of war. September 1945 marked the end of a harrowing chapter for women interned in Japanese camps across Southeast Asia. At Batulintang, Australian forces entered the camp to find prisoners emaciated, fevered, and weakened from years of forced labor and deprivation. Across the region, tens of thousands of civilian and military POWs were liberated, many of them women who had endured unspeakable conditions. Immediate post-war reports meticulously recorded the numbers. In Borneo alone, over 2,000 civilians had been interned, while across the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines, the combined population of women prisoners reached into the tens of thousands. The liberation also marked the beginning of systematic documentation of wartime abuses. Allied investigators, together with the International Committee of the Red Cross, collected testimonies detailing forced labor, malnutrition, public humiliation, and sexual harassment. These accounts formed the foundation of evidence presented in war crime tribunals, most notably the Tokyo trials of 1946 to 1948. Survivors recounted specific camp incidents, beatings for minor infractions, invasive searches, and forced labor under extreme heat. The trials revealed not only the individual acts of cruelty, but also the systemic nature of the abuses, demonstrating that these were not isolated incidents, but the outcome of institutionalized practices within the Japanese military administration. The meticulous documentation served a dual purpose. It established historical accountability, ensuring that the perpetrators could be brought to justice, and it preserved the memory of suffering endured by civilian women, experiences that might otherwise have been overshadowed by the broader narrative of military conflict. Despite the horror recorded, these testimonies also highlighted the resilience of the prisoners. Many described acts of solidarity, quiet defiance, and the extraordinary psychological endurance that allowed them to survive both the physical and emotional toll of internment. The immediate aftermath of liberation, therefore, was both relief and reckoning, a confrontation with the physical and moral devastation left behind by years of captivity. These records would later influence not only legal proceedings but the development of international norms surrounding the treatment of civilians and prisoners of war, shaping the principles that govern humanitarian conduct in conflict to this day. The liberation of the camps was only the beginning of a long and arduous recovery for survivors. Many women faced persistent physical ailments, malnutrition, untreated injuries, and tropical diseases contracted during internment. Psychological scars ran deeper. Recurring nightmares, anxiety, and hypervigilance became daily companions for years after the war. Survivor memoirs and post-war interviews reveal how the trauma of captivity influenced family life, social relationships, and personal identity. For some, the stigma of having endured conditions deemed humiliating intensified feelings of isolation. Even as they returned to communities eager to rebuild after the war, camp closures followed quickly after liberation. But the infrastructure of internment remained a haunting reminder of wartime brutality. Barracks were dismantled or repurposed, fences removed, and the land slowly reclaimed by local populations. Military policy also evolved in response to these experiences. The documented abuses of civilian and female prisoners influenced post-war revisions to the Geneva Conventions, particularly regarding the treatment of non-combatants and the necessity of protections against sexual abuse and forced labor. Japanese military authorities faced tribunals, and international scrutiny encouraged future commanders to adhere more closely to established rules of war. Historical memory became a critical component of the aftermath. Survivor testimonies, photographs, and camp records were preserved in archives, museums, and academic research, ensuring that these events remained part of the collective historical record. Commemorations and memorials, particularly in Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, honor both the suffering endured and the resilience demonstrated by the women. Their stories provide a human dimension to the broader narrative of World War II, reminding future generations that the consequences of war extend beyond the battlefield and into the lives of civilians caught in its path. Through these efforts, the experiences of women prisoners became both a cautionary tale and a testament to human endurance. The camp's closure did not erase the trauma, but it marked a transition from immediate survival to reflection, documentation, and eventual recognition. These post-war processes laid the groundwork for understanding the ethical, legal, and human dimensions of internment, setting the stage for the final reflections on what these events meant for history, humanity, and the laws of war. The story of women interned in Japanese camps during World War II is not only a record of suffering, but also a testament to endurance, dignity, and quiet courage. Within bamboo barracks, under the scorching sun and watchful eyes of guards, these women confronted daily humiliation, starvation, and fear. Yet they survived, not through grand heroics, but through solidarity, resilience, and the unwavering instinct to preserve their humanity against deliberate efforts to strip it away. Historically, their experiences illuminate the darkest intersections of ideology, war, and power. The abuses they endured reveal how systems of authority can exploit fear, how dehumanization can become routine, and how moral and ethical codes may be ignored in the fog of conflict. Their survival, however, offers a counterpoint, proof that human dignity can persist even in circumstances designed to eradicate it. For humanity, these stories carry enduring lessons. They remind us that war's consequences extend far beyond battlefields, that civilian lives are equally precious, and that the protection of human rights cannot be suspended even in times of conflict. They compel us to remember, document, and educate, so that the mistakes and atrocities of the past are neither forgotten nor repeated. In honoring these survivors, we acknowledge not only their suffering but